So here we are, episode 3. You can see right away we've got some pretty big updates. So we'll start right here. Obviously we've got the supercharger in place. As we mentioned in the previous video, you kind of put the bottom end in first, get that all bolted down, and then the top plate with the supercharger fits right on top. You can see we've got the fuel rail in here. So this is a custom piece. There's no injectors in it at the moment, just making sure that everything's gonna line up. Right now we're basically mocking everything up so we can get all the plumbing. There's gonna be a lot of hoses going on in here between vacuum and fuel. So we're working on making sure all that stuff is gonna line up in the right places before we start doing the final assembly. So see here, we've got the fuel pressure regulator. So there's some little 90 fittings that go in there that allows you to basically orient it however you want. We played around with it a little bit. I think this is kind of the best orientation. Although once we start routing the hoses, we may actually flip the regulator so we can run the hose the other way. But for now, we're gonna try running it across the front. So this is gonna be where the fuel return, basically the excess fuel comes out of the rail. And so that's gonna go to one of the two hoses right down there. And then the other side will be the feed. So that will go, again, from one of the lines there over to this guy here. So right now I've got that one angled up. So I'm kind of hoping to bring the fuel line sort of up and around, sort of up towards the firewall, since it's going to have to be sort of above to get onto that line. And then the third fitting on the fuel rail here, this one, we've got it, it's a tight fit, but we've got it angled, I think, just right. So that one's going to come up and go into the E-Cool injector right there. So I don't know if we've talked about that yet, but that's one of the cool features of this kit, is that it's got this extra fuel injector which sprays right into the supercharger, and that has two effects. Most importantly, it provides additional fuel that we're going to need when we're under boost, because this kit uses the stock size injectors, which would not be enough on their own to make the additional power. You need some additional fuel. So that's what this is for. And then additionally, because it's sort of ahead of the supercharger, as that fuel enters and evaporates, it's going to actually cool the intake air. So it kind of gives you the similar effect to like what an intercooler would have. So pretty cool unique way of doing that, but that's what that's all about. Couple of sort of order of operations things before we get too much further into this. In the previous video, we mentioned that we had to take off the alternator, and that definitely gave us more room to get the intake manifold in. You can see everything's pretty tight in there. And then there's also a brace. I don't know if I'm going to be able to show it very well. There's a brace down there on the underside of the intake manifold, similar to the stock one. And similar to the stock one, there's an important order of operations to this, where you're going to want to have the alternator out so that you can get the bulk of this stuff installed. But then the alternator has a long bolt that comes in from the back. And so you're going to have to put the alternator back on before you can put the intake manifold brace in place. Because that brace is a little bit, I would say it's too close, but I mean, it's in the factory location. And so that will get in the way of that long bolt coming through. And then originally we had put the fuel rail on before we put the supercharger on, but that made it really hard to get to these top bolts. So we ended up taking the fuel rail back off so we can make sure that we could get a torque wrench on all those bolts. So once we figured out the order that it goes in, it all actually fit in pretty nicely. So coming over here to the driver's side, you can see we've got the heat shield in place here for the air filter. Got that mocked up. Looks like that fits pretty nicely. We did have to file down a little bit this section here. It's a pretty tight fit, but it's just a little bit of extra material there. So we filed that down. You can see it was like this side, where it has this little lip on there. So then we're gonna come over to the bench here and take a look at a couple of other pieces that we're kind of preparing. So this is the EGR setup that comes with the kit. So this is the original line, and that's kind of how it sits in the car. It goes around the back of the cylinder head. And then they give us this adapter. This is 2 plates that have like a groove milled in them. And the result is that there's a channel that forms between there, and you see you use a little bit of RTV between them to seal it. But what that's going to do is kind of replicate what the factory intake manifold does. So it's going to allow the exhaust gas to come through this tube here, and then the valve will be controlling whether or not it comes out of that brass fitting. So then that brass fitting is going to connect to this guy here. And so this sort of square piece down there is actually sort of like a little manifold, which will allow the exhaust gas to flow into the intake. And then there's an additional fitting here and one on the other side down on the bottom right there. And so all of those are going to get plumbed in. We're going to do a whole video about all the vacuum routing and all of that. But essentially all of those are going to be what would have sort of been part of the intake manifold previously. We'll have the EGR, we'll have the idle controller, and the PCV all kind of flowing into that. And so you can see this fitting here is awfully tight to get a hose on it. So what we're actually going to do is remove that one, that 45-degree fitting, and put a straight fitting in. So then there's plenty of space kind of down along the fuel rail, or under the fuel rail. So we're going to run it just sort of down along and then out the front here. And I think that's just sort of a result of this fuel rail is made to work for an NA or an NB, which is why it has 2 sets of holes in it. And so on the NA it sits lower and kind of takes up some of the space down there. So luckily, as part of the kit, part of the instructions, they include the details for all those fittings, so it's easy enough to find that that was a 1/4-inch NPT to a 3/16 barb. And so that's something that's pretty readily available. So we're just going to swap that out, make things easier. Then if we come back over, there's also an adapter plate for the idle controller. So similar thing, flat plate, it's got a groove machined in it. And so basically the intake air is going to come in here just like it would have from the factory, and then it will exit through this, and then there's a brass fitting that's going to go in there, and that's going to feed over to the intake to control the idle. So that way, again, we're maintaining the factory ECU, and so that's going to be able to control the idle. The ECU won't really know the difference. But yeah, generally our parts table here is starting to get pretty light. We're getting a lot of things in. This was also a bracket. This was blocking the heat shield that we installed too. So there's just one bolt that comes out, and then we ground that little section for the intake. We did end up pulling the starter out. It made it a lot easier to get to some of the lower intake manifold bolts. So there you have it. A lot of progress. Basically just some plumbing things to go, and then we'll get into the wiring next. So thanks for watching, guys. Please leave me any questions you have in the comments, and I'll be sure to get back to you.